So, welcome to the Executive Coach Podcast. This is the podcast that helps professionals move from overwork in potentially a vague direction to a place of much more clarity, ease, and therefore success in work and life. I'm Maya, I'm your host, and today we're continuing our money journey. And having laid some of the foundations with the asset building thinking from Rich Dad, Poor Dad, I now want to get into the concept of financial independence, retire early, the FIRE movement. Now, this might be something you're very familiar with or something you haven't heard much about. I have seen that there are some spaces, for example, in the last decade, I've asked financial advisors about this and they haven't really known much about it. I wasn't taught it when I was doing the CFA. On the other hand, there are now, whole online communities discussing this stuff. I have discussed it with some of my more economically savvy friends, and there are podcasts and blogs dedicated to this topic. And the really hilarious part of it is that a lot of the people that have achieved financial independence, retired early, that have then made sort of a name for themselves in this space, are then making a living out of talking about it. So they've sort of retired and then basically done a career switch, which would be the slightly cynical way of looking at it. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk through the basics of it, because there are some useful basics here in the FIRE movement. Also going to talk about some iterations of FIRE or some different versions of it. And then finally, think about some of the pros and cons of the FIRE movement, and of course, some critique around it, because it wouldn't be the Executive Coach Podcast if we didn't take a critical lens at this and think in terms of how we're thinking about this concept. So for those of you who are very, very familiar with this concept, this first section, there won't be anything hugely new. Ultimately, we're trying to create a savings rate that is sufficiently high that we're able to accumulate assets, which then generate passive income that can cover our living expenses. And some of the numbers that are used are the 4% rule as a very rough withdrawal guideline. So once you've built up your pot, the idea of then living in a way that you withdraw 4% of that per annum. And therefore, if you do the maths on that, just some sort of simple, I guess, fractions here, if 4% is 1 year's expenses, then you're going to need 25 times that. So because 4% is 1/25th, you're going to need 25 times that amount in order to be able to withdraw that 4% to cover your expenses each year. So if that was a little bit complicated, just maybe write that down on a piece of paper or have a look online. Take my word for it. The idea is that you are guided by your withdrawal rate in terms of what that size of pot is. And I just think it's useful to hear these type of numbers, because I didn't feel in my finance and economics education that this idea of accumulating some sort of a pot that was a proportion of how much you wanted to withdraw from it, I don't feel that was really hammered home enough. Now, you could take a different number. You could take a more conservative rate, such as 3%, 3.25, 3.5, which would then mean that you would need to accumulate more income, so more like 28 to 30 times your estimated income. And that is particularly advised if you're planning to retire very early on, because I guess there are more permutations, more things that can happen both in the markets but also in your own life. Now, when you reach financial independence, of course, paid work then becomes optional so that you can pursue other activities or retire before reaching the typical retirement age. So I guess anyone who reaches a retirement age and is in a nice position, they've achieved FI, they've achieved FI, but the RE is about doing this earlier than you would have done according to sort of like government guidelines and things like that. So the way that you achieve that RE, the retire early bit, is through aggressive saving, far more than the standard typical rates. So a typical financial planner might suggest 10 to 15%. We are going to look at more of these breakdowns in some future episodes. But if you then say expenses are equal to income minus savings, then you can start to do some calculations around how many years you need to work to save 1 year's living expense, right? And therefore, what sort of savings rate you need to be able to achieve your pot of 25 times your living expenses. And the numbers, I think, get quite interesting, such that when you're at a savings rate of 10%, to just save 1 year's worth of living expenses, right? Because you're doing this all in proportion to your own savings, income, and expenses, it would then take you 9 years to save for that 1 year's expenses. As you increase that, so at 25% savings rate, which is significantly more, it would take you a lot less, 3 years to work to save for 1 year's living expenses, right? Because you are able to put away that proportion of your living expenses each year. And at a rate of 50%, it then takes 1 year to save for 1 year's living expenses, because obviously you're saving half of what you're earning is then going into that pot. And then once you start to go above that 50% rate of saving, then you're able to save, like for example, 75% saving rate, you're then able to, in 4 months, which is a third of a year, you're able to save 1 year's living expenses. So if that all sounds really complicated, just sit down with a pen and paper and have a write out of it, just to give yourself a sense of what these numbers can look like. The nice thing about these equations is that it all ties to your particular numbers, because you're basing it on your personal saving rate, which is a function of your expenses and your income. So it's quite neat, the maths around it. What we therefore get to see, and what the FIRE movement are very strong about, is this extreme savings rate. And this is also one of the reasons why it's criticized, because it is known for this sort of extreme frugality in the moment in the pursuit of this future goal. So that's the kind of basics around what the FIRE movement is. I think the real principle to take here is that when we can create that gap between our income and our expenses and have a savings rate, we can see that savings rate can do a lot of work for us. The bigger it is, no surprises there. But actually looking at the numbers, you can see what a disproportionate impact it starts to be able to have once you get over, say, for example, a 50% savings rate. And therefore, you can start to think about how long it would take you to achieve FIRE. And so in these FIRE circles, it's often about, what's your number? Like, what's your FIRE number? And once you've achieved your FIRE number, then you're the kind of lifestyle that you want, but you're so used to being so frugal that you actually then struggle to spend. And you've almost got yourself into a way of thinking and counting inside the spreadsheet that almost stops you from going out and living your life. So let's think about some of the different alternative FIRE routes. One of them, even more frugal, is lean FIRE. So that allows you to achieve financial independence even earlier through extreme frugality. So your expenses are really low, but what that means is that your investment portfolio required is also lower. So you're making it easier to achieve financial independence, but that is predicated on having a really strong frugality element, both when you are saving for it and then afterwards as well. Another version is Fat FIRE, which is where you want to retire, but you want to have a larger budget in your retirement than in traditional retirement planning. And so unlike other FIRE movements where you would actually have, in that instance, you would have more minimalism and reducing expenses, Fat FIRE is saying we want a more luxurious lifestyle in retirement. So it actually requires saving and investing a significant proportion of your income to build that nest egg. And so whilst you can retire earlier, you would need to really build a much bigger egg. So I guess your number of 25 there, if 25 times your expenses, that number would need to be significantly higher. But I guess what's useful is that we've got that benchmark of 25 to 30 times, and then you'd be looking to really increase that if you want to have this luxurious retirement early. Coast Fire is another version, and this is where you have two phases. The first is that you aggressively save to get an investment portfolio, and then you get, because you've done that upfront aggressive saving, you let it get to a point where the portfolio is then going to grow sufficiently just through the power of compound interest. And so then once you've got it to that place where it's growing based on the compound interest, you can stop or you can reduce your investing and have some freedom without being fully financially independent. So you've done some of that hard work of building up the portfolio such that it's actually generating a good return for you. And then whilst you don't need to then keep growing that pot, you have that financial freedom that exists, but you may continue to work. But your work, you feel like you're coasting. That's why it's called Coast Fire. Another version is Barista Fire. This is about switching to a less demanding part-time role, but that still gives you some income and some benefits. So, for example, you may still get health insurance. And so in some way, you're partially retired here. So you're not fully financially independent. You do want to be generating income and you want those benefits. This term is a specific reference to a part-time job at Starbucks in America where you do get health insurance. But with this approach, you cover your living expenses, but you might take some modest withdrawals from your investment portfolio, but you're allowing your portfolio to continue to grow, and you're kind of tiding yourself over as well. Now, the thing about FIRE is that it's not just an investment strategy, it's a way of life. And so one of the things that is talked about a lot in the FIRE lifestyle is finding partners that share the same fiscal goals. And that makes a big difference because you're able to work on it as a shared project and a shared endeavor. So that's your rundown of FIRE. Now, as you're listening to that, you might have thought of your own pros and cons around this. I just want to highlight a few. So, one of the ones that Laura Vanderkam and Sarah Hart Unger, who I listened to on the Best of Both Worlds podcast, talked about is that often what is happening is that people choose to do this aggressive approach. They then, in inverted commas, retire, but then they basically just crop up again in different working roles. And what they often end up doing is the kind of jobs that Laura Vanderkam and Sarah Hartinger are already doing. They podcast, they write, they have programs. And so in some, for those of us who do that as part of our work, you're thinking, well, you've financed a career change for yourself, but you've given it this fancy name of FIRE. So it just seems in some way like it could be a long way around, whereby if you had started to just build in aspects of that type of work into your current way of working, then you might have been able to achieve the same aims anyway. And of course, this is something that I am working on when I'm doing vision builder work with people, because we're thinking about that 10-year vision. And the most common thing that comes up is that people want to build more independence into their work, more autonomy, more freedom. And we're thinking about how they can do that in a really solid way. And that's why I do feel like knowledge of this concept is important, because I think it feeds in and it impacts your ability to make certain decisions and the timing of those decisions. But I do think that the big question that FIRE brings up is your relationship to your work. And so if you are of that 4-hour work week, Timothy Ferriss, of that book era, where work is something to be minimized and work is something that we don't like. And there's been a lot about that more recently in the quiet quitting movement and things like that. If that is your mindset, then yes, the FIRE movement seems to offer a solution to that. But obviously, I believe that there are other things that we can do as well. Like we can make our work enjoyable and meaningful. We can actually really derive a lot of joy and meaning from our work, and we can create work that we love. And I talk about Cal Newport's formula for work that you love, which is based on psychological principles, and we can really create those. So it doesn't have to be in a sphere where we're just absolutely passionate about that specific area. We can generate autonomy, independence, impact, and recognition in our work, and that can often lead to work that we love. So I think there is that relationship that needs to be examined with our work. And then the other criticism is from Ramit Sethi. And what he's saying is that there are some really good things about FIRE, which is that it encourages people to save because not enough people save enough, typically, especially in America. But what it doesn't do is help people to live their rich lives today. And that's obviously what he's on a mission to do. So, in that extreme frugality, I think he feels that what's lost is that ability to lean into our money dials and to be able to really enjoy those aspects of our lives. And I think he advocates not a restriction based thinking and restriction based approach to building wealth. And so, with that, this could feel a little bit more extreme. So I would say that those are two potential criticisms, that in the sense that, yes, we want to be working to financial independence, but do we really need this retire early, or do we need to rethink our work and strategically think about that? And the worst thing is, and I no joke, have heard quite a few podcasts about this, that you reach that FIRE and then you sort of fall off a cliff, in the sense that you're like, well, what now? What do I do? I have worked so hard. Everything that I have done, I've geared myself up. I've been so strategic, so diligent, so conscientious and planful. And what now? I'm just sort of meant to sit around and do nothing. So the type of individual that is going to get themselves into a FIRE position is not necessarily the type of person that then finds it easy to be retired forever. So these are some of the potential critiques. I hope you found that helpful. It's given a good foundation, a decent refresher. And of course, if you are thinking about your own stuff in relation to your future decade and how you want to start crafting more independent work that feels more autonomous, that gives you that freedom, definitely check out my resources. I will put them in the show notes, where you can have a look at maybe what stopped you from building your own vision till now. I've got a quiz about that. So that's one of the resources. Definitely check that one out. If you found this helpful, don't forget to share it with your partner if you think you guys need to get onto more of a fat FIRE, coast FIRE, barista FIRE, whichever FIRE journey it is that you feel that you might want to get onto. It's probably going to be better done in some sort of a teamwork. So share this with somebody and let me know how it goes. And I look forward to connecting with you next time. Bye bye.